The morning sun peeked through the worn curtains of a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, casting warm rays across a carefully arranged pile of dollar bills and coins on the bedroom floor. 12-year-old Andrew sat cross-legged, his fingers moving swiftly as he counted his savings for the fifth time that morning. $87.53, he whispered to himself, a mix of pride and anticipation in his voice. The money represented 2 months of early morning paper routes, helping neighbors with their groceries, and carefully saving every quarter and dollar that came his way. His eyes drifted to the worn-out basketball shoes tucked beneath his bed, the holes in the soles now covered with duct tape. The new shoes he'd been eyeing at the store downtown seemed to call his name every time he passed by the shop window. His mom had promised to help with the shoes, but life had other plans. Just last week, their old car had made strange noises, and the repair bill ate up the extra money she'd been setting aside. Andrew watched her shoulders slump when she told him about it, but he just hugged her tight and said, "It's okay, Mama. The car's more important." That was their life, making do, helping each other, finding ways to stretch every dollar. His mom worked 2 jobs, leaving before sunrise to clean offices downtown and returning late after her shift at the local diner. She never complained, always managing to have a warm smile and a warmer hug waiting for him when she got home. The sound of pots clattering in the kitchen pulled Andrew from his thoughts. His mom was preparing breakfast before heading out for her morning shift. The smell of oatmeal with cinnamon, their special breakfast, wafted through the small apartment. It wasn't fancy, but his mom always found ways to make simple things feel special. "Baby, you better start getting ready for school," she called out, her voice tired but gentle. Andrew carefully gathered his savings, wrapping the bills in a worn envelope and tucking the coins into a small cloth pouch. He'd been keeping the money in an old shoebox, hidden safely under a loose floorboard near his bed. As he got dressed for school, Andrew could hear Mrs. Chen from next door talking to his mom in the hallway. The elderly neighbor often brought them leftover pastries from her son's bakery, and they'd help her with heavy groceries or reading English letters. That's what his mom always taught him. In their community, they looked out for each other. Pulling on his backpack, Andrew paused by the small family photo on the wall. It showed him his mom and his grandfather, taken just months before Grandpa passed away. The old man wore his veteran's cap proudly, his kind eyes twinkling with the same warmth Andrew remembered from their Sunday afternoon talks. "Always look for ways to help others," Grandpa would say, "even when your own pockets are empty." With his savings secure in his backpack, Andrew hugged his mom goodbye. "I love you, Mama," he said, squeezing her tight. She kissed his forehead, her hand smoothing down his school shirt. "Love you more, baby. Have a good day at school." As Andrew headed down the stairs of their apartment building, he felt the weight of his savings against his back, imagining how those new basketball shoes would feel on his feet. Little did he know, this ordinary morning would lead to an extraordinary encounter that would change more lives than just his own. The afternoon sun beat down on the city streets as Andrew took his usual route home from school. His backpack felt heavier than normal, probably because he kept thinking about the envelope of money inside. Just 3 more blocks, and he'd be home, ready to show his mom how much he'd saved. Maybe they could go shoe shopping this weekend if she wasn't too tired from work. The familiar sights and sounds of his neighborhood surrounded him. The fruit vendor calling out his daily specials, kids playing double dutch on the sidewalk, and the steady hum of traffic from the main street. But something different caught his eye today as he passed the local grocery store. An elderly man sat quietly in a wheelchair near the store entrance. His clothes were clean but worn, and a veteran's cap rested on his gray hair. What struck Andrew most wasn't the wheelchair's squeaky wheel or the man's weathered face. It was the quiet dignity in his eyes, even as person after person walked past without a glance. Andrew slowed his pace, watching as a businessman in a hurry nearly knocked into the wheelchair while talking on his phone. The veteran simply adjusted his position, moving slightly closer to the wall. A lady with shopping bags looked away quickly when their eyes met, picking up her pace as she passed. The old man's shoulders seemed to sink just a little lower, but his head remained high. The scene reminded Ander of something his grandfather used to say during their Sunday talks. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never ask for help. He thought about how his grandpa would sit in his favorite chair, sharing stories about his time in the service, about brotherhood, and looking out for each other no matter what. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door. The veteran pulled his thin jacket closer around his shoulders. Ander noticed his hands. They were the kind of hands that had seen hard work, like his grandpa's had been. One hand rested on the wheelchair's wheel, and Ander could see it trembling slightly. Two young girls skipped past, their ice cream cones dripping in the warm sun. The veteran's eyes followed them briefly, and Ander caught a glimpse of something in that look. Not envy or bitterness, just a quiet sadness that made Ander's heart squeeze in his chest. He found himself walking closer, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain. From nearby, he could see that the wheelchair had definitely seen better days. The right armrest was held together with duct tape, the same kind Ander used on his basketball shoes. The left wheel made a soft squeaking sound with every small movement. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing at something on their phones. One of them accidentally bumped the veteran's wheelchair, muttering a quick sorry without looking up. The old man simply nodded, adjusting his cap with careful movements. His hands were shaking more now, and Ander noticed how he kept glancing at the grocery store entrance, then down at his empty lap. Something in Ander's chest tightened. He thought about his grandpa again, about all the stories of veterans helping veterans, of soldiers sharing their last meal with each other. The money in his backpack seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Those basketball shoes he'd been dreaming of suddenly felt less important. The veteran wasn't holding out a cup or a sign. He wasn't asking for anything. He just sat there, his eyes holding stories that nobody seemed interested in hearing. But Ander was interested. He remembered how his grandpa's eyes would light up when someone took the time to really listen to him, to hear about his life and his experiences. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Ander found himself taking a step forward, then another. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do or say, but something inside told him this was one of those moments his grandpa had talked about, when doing the right thing wasn't about thinking, it was about feeling. Ander's hand found its way to his backpack strap, fingers tightening around the worn fabric as he stood there, watching the veteran. The envelope of money seemed to burn through his backpack, making his heart race with each passing second. 2 months of early mornings, cold days, and careful saving weighed against the quiet dignity of the man before him. His mind wandered to the shoe store downtown, to those pristine basketball shoes in the window. He'd spent countless afternoons pressing his nose against the glass, imagining how they'd feel during games, how they'd replace his duct-taped pair that made squeaking sounds on the court. His teammates never said anything about his old shoes, but he saw their glances. The veteran shifted in his wheelchair, and the movement brought Ander back to the present. The old man's hands were clasped tightly in his lap now, knuckles white with tension. Ander noticed how he kept glancing at the grocery store's entrance, then quickly looking away, as if the sight of food was too much to bear. A memory floated up, clear as yesterday, sitting on their old couch with Grandpa, sharing the last cookie from the package. "You know what makes a person truly rich?" his grandfather had asked, breaking the cookie perfectly in half. "It's not what's in their wallet, son. It's what's in their heart when their wallet's empty." The sound of a passing bus made the veteran startle slightly. Ander watched as he tried to straighten his jacket, a simple movement that seemed to require too much effort. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and a cool breeze made the old man pull his thin jacket closer. Ander's fingers found the zipper of his backpack, and he felt the smooth envelope inside. His mom's voice echoed in his head. "We might not have much, but we have enough to share." She'd said that last winter when they'd invited Mrs. Chen over for Thanksgiving dinner, even though they barely had enough for themselves. His feet moved forward before his mind could catch up. each step bringing him closer to the veteran. The old shoes on his feet suddenly didn't feel so bad. They still worked, still got him where he needed to go. But this man who had served their country, who sat here with such quiet dignity, he needed help more than Andrew needed new shoes. A group of pigeons scattered nearby, cooing as they searched for crumbs. The veteran watched them with tired eyes, and Andrew caught a glimpse of something familiar in that gaze. The same look his mom got when she thought no one was watching, the weight of worry visible only in quiet moments. His grandfather's words came back stronger now. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't charging into battle. Sometimes it's reaching out a hand when your own pockets are empty. Andrew remembered how Grandpa would say this while showing him old photographs, pointing out friends who'd shared their last meal, their last dollar, their last hope with each other. The envelope felt heavy in his backpack, but his heart felt heavier. Those basketball shoes had seemed so important this morning. Now, watching the veteran's trembling hands and proud but weary posture, they felt like nothing more than a dream, while the reality sat right in front of him. Andrew thought about his mom, about how hard she worked, about the lessons she taught him through actions more than words. He thought about his grandfather's stories of brotherhood and sacrifice. The money in his backpack wasn't just cash. It was paper route mornings, helping neighbors, saving every penny. But maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what made it valuable enough to share. His decision crystallized like morning frost on a window, clear, delicate, and transforming everything it touched. The basketball shoes could wait. Some things couldn't. Taking a deep breath, Andrew walked up to the veteran, whose eyes lifted to meet his with a gentle curiosity. Up close, Andrew could see the medals pinned carefully to his worn jacket, each one telling a story of service and sacrifice. The old man's face softened into a kind smile, the kind that reminded Andrew of warm Sunday afternoons with his grandfather. "Good afternoon, young man," the veteran said, his voice soft but clear, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Andrew noticed how he straightened himself in his wheelchair, maintaining his dignity even as his hands trembled slightly on the armrests. "Sir," Andrew started, his voice catching a little. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here for a while." The words came out in a rush, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. The veteran's eyes crinkled at the corners as he nodded. "Just taking in the day," he said, but Andrew caught the slight quiver in his voice, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the grocery store entrance. "It's nice to watch the world go by sometimes." Andrew's hand found its way to his backpack zipper. "My grandpa was a veteran too," he said, the words flowing easier now. "He used to tell me stories about his time in service, about how soldiers always looked out for each other." Something flickered in the old man's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or remembered brotherhood. He touched the brim of his veteran's cap gently. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," he said, then paused, looking down at his hands. "Was?" Andrew nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "He passed last year, but he taught me a lot." His fingers found the envelope in his backpack, and he gripped it tightly. He always said that sometimes the biggest heroes are the ones who never ask for help. The veteran's eyes misted over slightly, but his smile remained steady. "Your grandfather and I would have gotten along well," he said softly. Then, almost to himself, he added, "It's been a long few days." Without hesitation now, Andrew pulled out the envelope. His hands were steady as he held it out. "Sir, I've been saving this money for something, but I think my grandpa would want you to have it instead." The veteran's eyes widened, and he raised his hands in protest. "Oh no, son, I couldn't possibly." "Please," Andrew interrupted gently. "My grandpa always said that giving when you have little means more than giving when you have much." He placed the envelope carefully in the veteran's weathered hands. "There's $87.53. I counted it 5 times this morning." The old man's hands trembled as he held the envelope. His eyes filling with tears, he tried to blink away. "Son, this is," he started, his voice rough with emotion. "It's what my grandpa would have done," Andrew said firmly, though his own eyes were getting misty. "And it's what I want to do." A warm breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying the sweet smell of fresh bread from the nearby bakery. The veteran looked at the envelope in his hands, then back at Andrew, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, perhaps hope, perhaps faith in humanity restored. "What's your name, son?" he asked softly. "Andrew, sir." "Well, Andrew," the veteran said, straightening his shoulders with newfound strength, "your grandfather would be proud. Very proud indeed." He carefully tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket, near his heart. "You remind me of the best men I served with, the ones who understood that true strength isn't in what you keep, but in what you're willing to give." Neither of them noticed the woman watching from her car across the street, her eyes fixed on this unexpected scene of compassion unfolding before her. She sat very still, her hand frozen on her car keys, witnessing something that would soon change more lives than either Andrew or the veteran could imagine. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Andrew stood with the veteran, who introduced himself as Mr. Thomas. The old soldier's eyes still glistened with emotion, but there was something else there now, a spark of life that hadn't been there before. "Son," Mr. Thomas said, his voice stronger now, "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Lost my benefits card somewhere between the VA office and here." He paused, gathering his dignity. "I was too proud to ask for help. Kept thinking something would work out." Andrew's heart squeezed in his chest. Without hesitation, he moved behind the wheelchair. "Then let's get you some food, sir. My grandpa always said a hungry soldier can't fight his battles." The wheelchair's right wheel squeaked as Andrew carefully guided it toward the grocery store entrance. Inside, the cool air and bright lights were a sharp contrast to the warm afternoon outside. Mr. Thomas sat up straighter in his chair, though Andrew could see his hands fidgeting with the envelope in his pocket. "Nothing fancy," the veteran insisted, "just some bread and maybe." "Grandpa always said protein helps you stay strong," Andrew interrupted gently, steering them toward the deli section. He remembered how his mom would stretch their grocery budget, finding the best deals while never compromising on what kept them healthy. As they moved through the aisles, Mr. Thomas shared bits of his story. He'd served in Vietnam, worked as a mechanic after coming home, and had been doing fine until a series of strokes left him dependent on a wheelchair. His voice grew softer when he mentioned how his pride had kept him from reaching out to old friends for help. Andrew listened intently, pushing the cart while Mr. Thomas held a small basket in his lap. They picked out bread, eggs, some fruit, and sandwich meat. The veteran's eyes lit up at the sight of coffee. Real coffee, not the instant kind served at the shelter where he sometimes stayed. "My wife Carol, she used to say a good cup of coffee could solve half the world's problems," Mr. Thomas said with a gentle smile, reaching for the smallest package. Andrew noticed how his hand trembled slightly, and without a word, reached for the larger size instead. At the checkout counter, the total came to just over $30. Mr. Thomas tried to hand back the remaining money, but Andrew shook his head firmly. "Sir, you might need it for tomorrow or the next day. Grandpa always said planning ahead was as important as helping today." The cashier, an elderly woman with kind eyes, watched their interaction with a warm smile. She quietly added an extra loaf of bread to their bag, winking at Andrew when Mr. Thomas wasn't looking. Outside the store, they found a small bench in the shade. Andrew helped arrange the grocery bags so they'd be easy for Mr. Thomas to manage. The veteran's eyes were bright now, his shoulders straighter, as if the simple act of buying groceries had restored something essential. "You know," Mr. Thomas said softly, "I've been sitting out here for 3 days, watching people walk by. Hundreds of people." He reached out and gently patted Andrew's hand. "But you were the only one who really saw me." Andrew thought about his basketball shoes, about the holes in his current pair that would have to last a bit longer now. Looking at Mr. Thomas's grateful face, at the grocery bags that would keep him fed for at least a week, He knew he'd made the right choice. What neither of them realized was that the woman in the parked car was still watching, her hands now busy taking notes on her phone. She'd witnessed everything. The gentle way Andra helped with the wheelchair, the careful selection of groceries, the quiet dignity of their interaction. In her 20 years of working with charitable foundations, she'd never seen anything quite like this. In her silver sedan across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez watched as Andra helped Mr. Thomas arrange his grocery bags. 20 years as the director of a community foundation had shown her countless acts of charity. But this was different. This was pure, unscripted kindness that made her heart ache with hope. She'd been parked here for 3 days, observing the neighborhood as part of her foundation's research into community needs. Her notebook was filled with observations about foot traffic, local businesses, and the daily rhythms of life in this part of the city. But nothing had prepared her for what she'd just witnessed. Taking out her phone, Mrs. Rodriguez began making calls. "Pat, cancel my afternoon meetings." She spoke quietly into her phone. "Something just happened that needs our immediate attention." Her fingers flew across the screen as she made notes, not wanting to forget a single detail of what she'd observed. As Andra said goodbye to Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Rodriguez noticed how the young boy stopped to help adjust the veteran's jacket collar, a small gesture that spoke volumes about his character. She watched as Mr. Thomas reached up to pat Andra's hand one last time, saw how the boy's shoulders straightened with quiet pride, despite his worn clothes and scuffed shoes. Once Andra had turned the corner, Mrs. Rodriguez stepped out of her car. The afternoon air had cooled, and the street was quieter now. She approached Mr. Thomas carefully, her heels clicking softly on the sidewalk. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently. "I couldn't help but witness what just happened. Would you mind telling me about that young man?" Mr. Thomas looked up, his eyes still bright with emotion. "That boy," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "He gave me his last dollar without thinking twice. Been saving for new shoes, he told me, but said I needed it more." He patted the grocery bags in his lap. "First proper meal I'll have in days. Thanks to him." Mrs. Rodriguez sat on the bench nearby, listening as Mr. Thomas shared more details about their interaction. Her heart swelled as he described how Andra had helped him shop, choosing foods that would last, making sure he had enough for several days. "You know what really got me?" Mr. Thomas said, adjusting his veteran's cap. He kept talking about his grandfather, another veteran. Said he was just doing what his grandpa would have wanted. "In all my years, I've never met a young person with such an old soul." Taking out her notebook, Mrs. Rodriguez began asking careful questions about the neighborhood. She learned about the local school where Andra studied, about the community that looked out for each other despite their own struggles. Mr. Thomas painted a picture of a place where people had little but shared what they had. The streetlights were starting to flicker on when Mrs. Rodriguez finally stood up. She handed Mr. Thomas her business card, explaining about her foundation's work in the community. "What I saw today," she said, her voice soft but determined, "that's the kind of spirit we need to support and celebrate." Driving home that evening, Mrs. Rodriguez's mind was already working on a plan. In her 2 decades of charitable work, she'd learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could inspire the biggest changes. She thought about Andra's worn shoes, about Mr. Thomas's dignity, about the quiet strength she'd witnessed in their interaction. Tomorrow, she would start making more calls. This wasn't just about helping one boy or one veteran. It was about recognizing and nurturing the kind of compassion that could transform a community. As she stopped at a red light, Mrs. Rodriguez smiled, knowing that neither Andra nor Mr. Thomas had any idea that their simple interaction was about to spark something much bigger than either of them could imagine. The next morning, Mrs. Rodriguez walked through the halls of the local middle school, her heels echoing against the worn linoleum floors. The principal, a warm-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, led her toward the cafeteria where students were having lunch. "That's him," the principal whispered, nodding toward a table in the corner. Andra sat sharing his lunch with a smaller boy who had none. Even from across the room, Mrs. Rodriguez could see the same gentle spirit she'd witnessed yesterday. "Tell me about him," she asked softly, watching as Ander offered half his sandwich to his hungry classmate. The principal's eyes softened. "That boy. He's something special. Last month, when little Bobby couldn't afford the class field trip fee, Andrew spent 2 weekends helping Bobby's mom clean houses to earn the money. Never said a word about it. We only found out when Bobby's mother called us crying with gratitude." They moved down the hallway, stopping at the library. Through the window, Mrs. Rodriguez watched as Andrew helped a younger student with math homework during his free period. His patience was evident in the way he explained the same problem multiple times, never showing frustration. The librarian, adjusting her glasses, shared her own story. "Last winter, when we had that terrible cold snap, Andrew noticed one of our regular library visitors, an elderly man, didn't have proper gloves. The next day, he brought in a pair his grandfather had left behind. Said they were too nice to just sit in a drawer." In the art room, colorful paintings lined the walls. The art teacher pointed to a particular piece, a simple but touching portrait of an elderly couple sharing a meal. Ander painted that after helping at the senior center's lunch program. He volunteers there twice a month, usually spending his entire Saturday serving food and listening to the residents' stories. Mrs. Rodriguez's notebook filled with similar tales. The custodian spoke of how Ander always stayed after school events to help clean up, even though no one asked him to. The school nurse remembered how he'd sit with sick students waiting for their parents, telling funny stories to keep their spirits up. "But here's what really gets me," the gym teacher added during their conversation. "His shoes are falling apart. You can see he needs new ones badly. Yet last week, when we had a charity drive for sports equipment, he brought in his nearly new basketball. Said someone else might need it more than he did." Outside the school, Mrs. Rodriguez spoke with local shop owners. The bakery owner smiled warmly, sharing how Ander would help her unload deliveries before his paper route, accepting only a simple thank you in return. The grocery store cashier from yesterday recognized him as the boy who often helped elderly customers carry their bags to their cars. At the community center, she found more stories. The youth program coordinator spoke of Ander's regular visits to read to younger children. "He has this way about him," she explained, "makes every child feel special, like their story matters." But it was the conversation with Mrs. Chen, Ander's elderly neighbor, that truly captured his spirit. "That boy," she said, her eyes misting over, "he reminds me every day that goodness still exists in this world. When my arthritis acts up, he helps me sort my medications. When I receive letters in English, he reads them to me. Never makes me feel like a burden." As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Rodriguez sat in her car, reviewing her notes. She'd come looking for confirmation of what she'd witnessed yesterday, but she'd found so much more. Ander wasn't just a boy who'd helped a veteran one time. He was a bright light in his community, touching lives in countless small but significant ways. Her phone buzzed with messages from the foundation board, asking about her delayed response to their pending projects. But Mrs. Rodriguez knew she'd found something more important. A story that needed to be told, a spirit that needed to be nurtured, and a kind of goodness that deserved to be recognized and celebrated. 2 weeks later, Ander and his mother stood at the entrance of the community center, both looking slightly nervous in their Sunday best. His mom had taken an extra shift at the diner to get the evening off, and Ander noticed how tired she looked despite her bright smile. "Baby, why won't you tell me what this meeting is about?" she asked, smoothing his collar for the 3rd time. Ander just shrugged, equally confused. The principal had only said it was important for them to attend tonight's community gathering. The community center's main hall had been transformed. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and colorful streamers hung from the ceiling. The usual fluorescent lights had been replaced with softer lighting, giving the room a warm glow. Ander recognized faces from around the neighborhood. His teachers, the local shop owners, even Mrs. Chen sitting in the front row. As they found their seats, Ander's heart nearly stopped. There in the front row, sat Mr. Thomas in his wheelchair, looking healthier and stronger than before. The veteran smiled warmly, touching his cap in greeting. Before Andrew could respond, the room fell quiet as Mrs. Rodriguez stepped up to the podium. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice warm and clear. "We're here tonight because 2 weeks ago, I witnessed something extraordinary, something that reminded me why our foundation exists." She paused, looking directly at Andrew. "I saw a young boy give his last dollar to help a stranger." Andrew felt his face grow warm as heads turned toward him. His mother's hand found his, squeezing gently. Mrs. Rodriguez continued, describing what she'd witnessed that afternoon outside the grocery store. Then, one by one, people began standing up to share their own stories about Andrew. His math teacher spoke about how Andrew tutored struggling students during lunch. The bakery owner described his early morning help with deliveries. Mrs. Chen's voice shook with emotion as she talked about his daily kindnesses. With each story, Andrew sank lower in his seat, uncomfortable with the attention, but touched by the warmth in everyone's voices. Then Mr. Thomas wheeled himself to the front. "This young man," he said, his voice strong and clear, "didn't just give me money for food. He gave me back my dignity, reminded me that I wasn't invisible." The veteran's eyes shone as he spoke. "He told me he was doing what his grandfather would have wanted. Well, I'm here to tell you that his grandfather would be prouder than words can say." Andrew felt tears sliding down his cheeks as his mother wrapped an arm around his shoulders. He could feel her body shaking with quiet sobs of pride. Mrs. Rodriguez returned to the podium, her own eyes glistening. "In light of what I've learned about this remarkable young man, our foundation is announcing 2 new initiatives tonight." She opened an envelope. "First, we're establishing a full college scholarship in Andrew's name, which he will be the first to receive." The room erupted in applause. Andrew's mother gasped, her hand covering her mouth. But Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Second, inspired by Andrew's interaction with Mr. Thomas, we're launching a veteran support program. Mr. Thomas has agreed to help us run it, ensuring that no veteran in our community ever has to go hungry or feel invisible again." The applause grew louder. Andrew saw Mr. Thomas straighten in his wheelchair, pride evident in his bearing. Mrs. Chen was wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. His teachers were beaming. "But there's one more thing," Mrs. Rodriguez said, gesturing to the side door. 2 staff members wheeled in a cart covered with a cloth. "Andrew, could you come up here, please?" On shaky legs, Andrew made his way to the front. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled back the cloth, revealing several pairs of new basketball shoes. "These are for the school team," she explained. "And this pair," she lifted a special box, "is for you. Because sometimes, when you give up something you need to help others, the world finds a way to help you back." 1 year later, the community center buzzed with activity on a bright Saturday morning. Where once there had been empty rooms, now there was life and purpose in every corner. Andrew, now 13, stood beside Mr. Thomas, watching as young volunteers served breakfast to local veterans. The Veteran Support Program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a simple food assistance initiative had blossomed into something much more meaningful. Veterans now had a place to gather, share stories, and most importantly, feel seen and valued. "Remember that day outside the grocery store?" Mr. Thomas asked, his eyes twinkling as he adjusted his now polished wheelchair. "Who would have thought your $87.53 would turn into all this?" Andrew smiled, watching as Mrs. Chen taught a group of veterans how to fold origami cranes. She had become a regular volunteer, claiming that the veterans reminded her of her late husband. The room was filled with laughter as paper cranes of various shapes and sizes took form under her patient guidance. The bakery owner arrived with her usual Saturday donation of fresh bread and pastries, but now she had company. 3 other local businesses had joined her initiative. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as veterans and volunteers mingled, sharing stories and creating bonds that bridged generations. In one corner, Andrew's mother chatted with Mrs. Rodriguez. After the foundation's scholarship announcement, she had cut back to just one job, using her extra time to help coordinate the center's activities. The worry lines on her face had softened, replaced by laugh lines that crinkled when she smiled. "You know what makes me proudest?" Mr. Thomas said, watching as a young volunteer helped an elderly veteran with his coffee. "It's not just what we do here, it's what's happening out there." He gestured toward the window, where they could see people going about their daily lives. He was right. The neighborhood had changed. The grocery store now had a pay-it-forward board where customers could buy extra meals for veterans in need. The local barber offered free haircuts every Tuesday. Even the school had started a program where students could earn community service credits by helping at the center. "Your grandfather would love this," Mr. Thomas continued, his voice soft with emotion. "Not just the program, but how it's brought people together. How one act of kindness kept growing." Andrew thought about the basketball shoes he'd originally saved for. He was wearing new ones now, not the ones from the ceremony, but ones he bought himself from his paper route money. This time, buying them had felt different. They weren't just shoes anymore. They were a reminder that sometimes giving up something you want can lead to getting something you need, like the satisfaction of making a difference. The morning sun streamed through the windows as more people arrived. A group of students from Andrew's school, the same ones who used to stare at his old, taped-up shoes, now volunteered regularly. They had started a club dedicated to community service, inspired by the story they'd heard at last year's ceremony. Mrs. Rodriguez's foundation had expanded its programs, using Andrew's story as an example of how small acts of kindness could transform communities. They'd helped start similar veteran support programs in neighboring areas, each one adapted to local needs, but all built on the same principle, that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. As Andrew helped serve breakfast, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. He saw his grandfather's kind eyes looking back at him, and for a moment, he could almost hear the old man's voice. "See, son, true wealth isn't about what's in your wallet. It's about what's in your heart." The morning continued, filled with the warm chatter of voices, the clink of coffee cups, and the sound of laughter. In this room full of people who had once been strangers, there was now a family, one built not on blood ties, but on the simple truth that kindness, once given, has a way of coming back multiplied.